Once again, good morning. The reading this morning began, there are those who mistakenly think that world peace can only come when there is a unity of opinions and dispositions. Anyone who studied any history knows that much violence has been done in that name of peace, in the name of that kind of peace. But the rabbi continued, on the contrary, even those concerns that appear superfluous or contradictory, it is through them that the light of truth and justice will be seen. The song that was sung earlier, Everything's Made Up, was written by a Christian drag queen named Flamey Grant, which I think is a wonderful name if any of you ever listen to any Christian music. And recently my family saw her perform at a Baptist church in Worcester. Her Christian album, Bible Belt Baby, was this atheist's favorite album of 2022. How was that for contradictory? Oh yeah, excellent. This was at the church in Worcester. Thanks, TC. and this question reminds me of Walt Whitman's famous lines, do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. I am large and I contain multitudes. Will we make ourselves small enough to avoid contradiction? As if we even could? Will we require that our communities, our families, our church, our country, try to make themselves that small? If there's no God, how can you convince someone it's wrong to murder? After losing my Christian faith, I was asked questions like this often by friends and evangelists. I would usually respond with a question. Do you think murder is wrong? When they would invariably respond, yes, I'd say, that was easy. Okay, now, let's try your method. You'll have to start by convincing me that your religion's God exists and wrote a book that only your church interprets correctly. Seems like that's going to be a lot harder than my method. Despite my snarky, immature response, I do know what they meant. Without a shared divine or absolute authority, how could I convince anyone that my morality was the absolute capital T truth? It's actually really easy to answer that question. I can't. Morals are values. They are opinions, not facts. I can make a simple argument against harming others. I don't want to be harmed. Other people also desire that. Golden rule. I'm basically done, right? I've convinced you. Except if someone doesn't agree on the golden rule, we're going to get stuck there. David Hume argued that one cannot logically move from statements of fact to statements of value. In simpler terms, just because something is a certain way doesn't necessarily mean that it ought to be that way. The inverse is also important. Just because we feel something ought to be a certain way doesn't mean that it is. We're tempted to bridge the gap between murder is harmful, a factual statement, and murder is wrong, a moral judgment, solely through observable data. Hume would argue that such a leap is inherently flawed. The principle, aptly named Hume's Guillotine, sharply divides facts and values. Of course, facts can, and I think should, inform values. The fact that our treatment of chicken, cattle, and pigs is brutal informs my moral conclusion that we should regulate that process and be willing to pay more for meat and dairy. How much more? Well, that's a harder question. Someone else may argue that the level of suffering is necessary to produce enough food so that humans can afford to eat and don't suffer starvation, hunger. And yet another person who believes other animals should not be murdered for human food may conclude veganism is the moral response. How can the vegan convince me not to murder animals? So far, they haven't had much luck. But I don't think any of the three of us need to spend that much time worrying about a person who's willfully ignorant or in denial about the facts of animal suffering. So when we ponder questions like, how can we justify moral beliefs without appealing to a shared divine authority? Or can we reconcile conflicting moral convictions in a pluralistic society? We must grapple with the implications of Hume's Guillotine. It challenges us to recognize the inherent subjectivity of moral judgments. In his book *Sapiens*, Yuval Noah Harari argues for the value of myths. Quote, any large-scale human cooperation, whether a modern state, a medieval church, an ancient city, or an archaic tribe, is rooted in common myths that exist only in people's collective imagination. He goes on to talk about the power of that shared mythology to shape our moral opinions. Yes, of course, religion, but also things like declarations of independence, universal human rights, communism, money. The power of all these myths comes from the shared value that groups place on them. While we're at it, let's add our church's first principle to the list. It is a powerful and uniting myth that every person has inherent worth and dignity. In this way, those evangelists were right. But let's avoid the mistake of imagining the world is the way we've come to agree it ought to be. We have these strong moral emotions, intuitions, and desires. They're so internalized that even the self-proclaimed moral relativists can't help but feel they're more than an opinion. But if we proceed this way, we'll be tempted into complacency. No need to make the world the way it already is. Or arrogance. Thank God we aren't like those people, those villains who can't see our moral conclusions are so obvious. Is this why our UU faith encourages us to seek truth and wisdom from experience, reason, and science alongside a variety of religious and spiritual traditions? Perhaps so. These stories we tell together can't make our truths into absolutes, but they are a way we share them with each other and potentially change minds, including our own. Here's the part that I find most challenging. Even when we correctly identify our values, our opinions, and we share them, we don't necessarily prioritize them the same way. Failure to consider this can lead us to think people are bad when we actually share so many values in common. Let's go back to the meat production example. All three of the people in this example likely share many values. For example, we probably all agree that animals shouldn't suffer unnecessarily, that humans should have access to tasty and nutritious food, and that no one should go hungry because they can't afford to eat. If the person who wants the lowest prices claims that I don't care if people starve, or the vegan claims that I don't care about human suffering, it's so easy for me to just dismiss those accusations, because I know I do care about those things. In this scenario, they're mistaking our different prioritization as opposing values. It's easy to see when it's done to us. But how can we use this concept to inspire grace for those who draw different moral conclusions from us? I've been a teacher for 20 years, so I am going to give some homework assignments. On the bright side, it's not math homework, and I'm not going to grade it. April will call them challenges. The first one you can do today. Take a look on your order of service. If you have one, grab it now. If not, grab one on the way out. On the back, it includes our UU principles. These are the principles that we ostensibly, though not necessarily, share. Pick two. Ask yourselves, which of these do I prioritize higher? What moral conclusions might that lead me to draw? If I were to switch the order that I was prioritizing these, might I draw some different moral conclusions? The second one is a lot harder. Next time you're morally outraged by someone with a different opinion, ask yourself a few questions. Could we be prioritizing shared values differently? If we really do have different values, how might their experiences and mythologies lead them to their values? Is it really so different than how I came to my conclusions? Are all moral opinions just equal then? Does none of this matter? Well, yes and no. Yes, moral relativism is a fact. All of our moral opinions are justified, if at all, by the same authority by which we declare our favorite band. But as I hope you've seen by now, facts can't tell us what we should care about. And what we care about leads to our words and our actions. and those impact others and shape the world. Do all moral opinions lead to words and actions that shape the world equally? Obviously not. In that way, I'd argue it's vital that we discuss and debate morality, and we examine our own morality. Pluralism doesn't mean unity of opinion, and it doesn't mean we have to ignore points of disagreement. It does mean we're going to have to follow the golden rule and treat others' opinions the way we want our opinions to be treated. But that's just like my opinion, man. The last quote I'm going to share was recounted in the book Coddling of the American Mind. It's a book that I both enjoyed and strongly criticized. But the quote comes from a Russian dissident, Alexander S., who was sentenced to hard labor for criticizing Joseph Stalin. While being marched for days, reflecting on his unselfish dedication to the motherland, he remembers that he almost joined the security service, which later evolved into the KGB. It occurs to him that he could have just as easily been the guard marching in. Alexander said, "If only it were so simple. If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. And who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart?" Thank you.